we'll let Kendall go here and maybe just start with your story and your journey in wine.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. Well, I kind of followed a non-traditional path into the wine industry because I was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. Not a lot of vineyards or wineries up there. But my parents had a wine cellar, and so I wouldn't say wine was an everyday part of the family, but it was common enough that I developed an interest in it. My undergrad was in microbiology, and I was trying to figure out how am I going to use this microbiology? What am I going to do with it? I took an introduction to brewing and winemaking my senior year. And at the end of that, I talked to my professor and people really do this for a living? You know, doesn't your family have to own a vineyard or something to do this? And he said, no, but you do need to go down to UC Davis if that's what you really want to do. So I ended up applying and getting into UC Davis and went down there the following year, and have never really looked back since. After being in California, finishing my school and getting into the industry, my wife, who's also Canadian, was having some visa issues, visa challenges. So that prompted me to look at Washington, coming back up to Washington. So moved up to Washington in 1993, joined the Chateau Saint Michel team. They were building a new red wine facility on Canoe Ridge, and that presented a perfect opportunity for me. So I moved up, joined the red wine making team for Saint Michel, worked under Mike Janik and Charlie Hoppus for a number of years before they left to do their own projects. Then worked under Ron Banal. We also started working with the Antinoris in that time frame and started the Cellars project. We didn't have a name for it at that point, but it evolved into the Cellars project. And then in 2003, so I'd been with Saint Michel for 10 years, ended up moving over to the other Canoe Ridge in Walla Walla. Spent 2 vintages there. And then Mike Corliss came calling, and he was building his winery in Walla Walla. I don't know if any of you have been able to see that facility, but it's a pretty amazing facility, and gave me an opportunity to make those wines. I did those wines for 6 years until 2010. Then I ventured over to Goose Ridge to be closer to home. We've always lived in the Tri-Cities since we moved to Washington. So working in Walla Walla was an hour commute, and we had 3 young children at the time that were pretty busy. And being an hour away from home was not conducive to happy family life. So moved over to Goose Ridge. There ended up being 5 minutes from work, so that was wonderful. Spent 4 vintages there. Then I went back to Walla Walla and joined the Curated team. Spent 3 vintages there with Curated, and then in 2017, the Milbrands came calling and enticed me to go up to Mattawa, where my day job is winemaker for Waloop Wine Company, Milbrand Vineyards, and Ryan Patrick. And through this whole process, we started doing Lawrelin in 2000. It started out as an opportunity to work with some Red Mountain fruit, because being part of the Saint Michel team, Saint Michel wasn't sourcing any grapes off of Red Mountain in those days. So I'd always heard how wonderful Red Mountain was from the time that I moved up here, and it had never worked with the fruit. So when St. Michel gave the okay for winemakers to go out and make a little bit of wine for themselves, I jumped on the opportunity to start working with some Red Mountain fruit. So I contacted Scott Williams at Kiona, got a little bit of Cab from him and a little bit of Syrah. And that's how Lawrelin started. It was 4 barrels of Cab and 1 barrel of Syrah, basically, from the 2000 vintage. And then we've pretty much kept it Cab and Syrah up until 2014. We'll release some different blends. We've got a couple different Rhone blends that have been bottled now, been in bottle for a few years. A GSM from Lonesome Spring Ranch, and then in 15 we added a Boucher Rhone blend, co-fermented Rhone blend from Boucher Vineyard. We've also started working with Elephant Mountain, so we'll have an Elephant Mountain Cab coming out with 2019 was our first vintage with Elephant Mountain, so it's still in barrel. But the idea of aging wines longer, I think, comes from my experience with my parents' wine cellar. They liked to hold on to their wines and drink older wines, and I think I developed a little bit of a palate from that experience and enjoyment of those older wines. During this, as this was starting to get going, the other thing that was going on was, 2 Canadians trying to get licensing and get permitted to have a winery in the state of Washington. So we had been working in Washington under NAFTA free trade work visas, and we both qualified for those. So those visas are just renewable on an annual basis, and we had just kept doing that. And then when we started this business, they told us, well, you can't have a business license from a temporary work permit, so you have to become permanent residents. So in 2001, we started the process to become permanent residents. And as you know, the world changed on 9/11. What was supposed to take 3 years prior to that took us almost 8 to become permanent residents. So that was really the main driving force. We couldn't actually have an active business until we became permanent residents. So we just held on to the wines and cellared them, tasted the wines, periodically, kept making wine, and the wines were tasting wonderful. So initially, I was a little worried because Washington hadn't really, in those days, Washington hadn't really established itself as an area where you could really produce really lovely, ageable red wines from, or at least didn't have the reputation for it. So there was some nervous moments, but we kept tasting the wines and they kept holding up really well and tasting really lovely. So we just kind of rolled with it. And then, the other factor that played into that was changing the day jobs a few different times over the course of that time frame. Created some additional hurdles to try to get over. But we actually got everything in place, got our business license, got our winery permit, got everything, all the legal stuff buttoned up and taken care of, and released our first release in 2012. So our first release was a combination of 2000, 2001, and 2002. We released 3 vintages all at once. And then we've kind of been on a path of releasing a new vintage every year, every other year. There was a couple times where we'd stick years in there, but now I think the last few years we've released the next vintage on an annual basis, and we kind of see ourselves continuing to do that as we move forward. We'll see what happens. We're in the process of opening our first tasting room over in Walla Walla. So, depending upon how that works and working with Pierce, the quantities that we're working with are pretty small. So typically we do about 300 cases a year, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but it's usually 300 to 350 cases a year. So the inventories are pretty boutique-ish. So if sales start picking up and we need to release wines a little bit earlier, I think I'd be okay with that. But I'd like to keep the wines releasing at about 10 years post vintage and not go any sooner than that. So we've made wine pretty much every year between 2000 and 2019, with the exception of we did not make wine in 2010, 11, or 12. So since we were basically doing this out of pocket, we weren't selling any wine until 2012. It got pretty financially difficult to keep making wine through all those years, but now I think we're in a much better place, and we'll hopefully see our numbers grow a little bit, but not too much. I think we made 450 cases in the 19 vintage is what we have in barrel right now. So one of our bigger vintages that we've ever had.
So what initially attracted you to Red Mountain early on? I mean, it was by no means its own AVA, and really probably in 2000 had limited notoriety. What drew you kind of to that region of Washington?
Well, I just talking with other winemakers who had worked with that fruit. Charlie and Mike Janik had both worked with that fruit before they went to work for St. Michel, so they knew of it. I tasted some of the wines coming from Red Mountain, and this was before there was a Red Mountain AVA, so it was but there was a lot of curiosity just from conversations with Mike and Charlie and some of the wines that I had tasted. And it's only about 20 minutes from the Tri-Cities, or even less, so I kind of felt like it was in my own backyard. And I felt at St. Michel, we were working with such a wide array of vineyards and AVAs sourcing from all over the state. It really seemed like a glaring absence in my day job, not being able to work with Red Mountain. And I'd gone out to look at the vineyards and berries, particularly the Cabernet berries, stayed very tiny, very concentrated. There's a lot of heat units in that AVA. It's one of the warmest AVAs in the state. So all of those things kind of fueled the curiosity to want to be able to work with some of that fruit and see what I could do with it. And the nice thing about it was, with Lawrelin, I could do exactly what I wanted. I wasn't beholden to anyone else other than myself. So we made the first few wines at Canyon de Sol. I don't know if that name rings a bell to anybody. It's a small little winery. They're not even around anymore. But I had a buddy that started that winery, so we made it completely separate. and I would go down. I would get up in the morning, zip over there. It's in Badger Canyon. I don't know if that means anything to people, but 15 minutes from outside the Tri-Cities. I'd punch down the bins in the morning, check bricks, go out and to St. Michel, to Canoe Ridge Estate, do my job out there, come back in the evening, punch the bins down again, check the bricks again, and go home. And so it was, it was a very fun project, and felt very personal, very, very hands-on. At St. Michel, I wasn't really getting my hands dirty too much. So, we had a cellar crew that kind of took care of most of the hands-on tasks in the winery. So it was a good way for me to get out and get involved and get my hands dirty.
Yeah, punch downs will do that. Nice workout to start your day.
Yeah. So to this day, we're still doing punch down fermentations, because typically all of our fermentations are, between 1 and 2 tons in size. Currently, the biggest lot of fruit that we get is Red Mountain Cab. We're working with Quintessence Vineyard, and have been working with them for the last several years. That's where the Red Mountain Cab is coming from. And so last year we had 2.25 tons of Red Mountain Cab. That was our biggest fermenter. So we had a couple of different 1-ton punch down fermenters going for that one. The other thing with the wines have always been pressed off in a basket press wherever they've been made. So it's that's moved around over the years too. So we were at Canyon do Sol for the first 3 years. Then ended up, when I joined Corliss, started making the wines over at Corliss. And then the wines have followed me. Typically the wines have followed me wherever my day job has been. Up until 2013, when we make the wines at Wine Boss the last several vintages. So I'm still really good friends with Charlie Hoppus. Wine Boss is his facility where he's making Fidelitas, and so it's fun for me. Keeps me connected with those guys, and they're right in Richland. So again, it's easy for me to stop in the morning and on my way home and kind of keep tabs with what's going on with those wines.
Charlie bet pretty heavy on Red Mountain, right? He went all in now.
He did, yeah. Fidelitas is completely focused on Red Mountain.
Yeah. He left some pretty great vineyards to do that too. So he's a true believer. We get that early on, testing that out throughout those early 2000s. So that's kind of neat.
He is for sure. And I think that's probably where a lot of my interest came from, just listening to him talk about it. And it's lived up to it. Absolutely. It's a fantastic AVA. Was really excited when they did get their AVA approved. It's well deserved. And as we looked around, quite honestly, as we looked around for where we wanted to put a tasting room, we would love to have it on Red Mountain, but we don't have the resources to build our own facility. So we need to go somewhere where we could lease something, and so Walla Walla presented that opportunity. We've been looking around for probably 2 or 3 years, waiting for the right spot, the right location, and finally it popped up earlier this year. So we're going to be right down in downtown Walla Walla, right kitty corner from, or not quite exactly kitty corner, but a few storefronts down from the Marcus Whitman in Walla Walla.
That's a great spot. Walla Walla is a fun place to go wine tasting if any of you guys haven't made it down there. So do you feel like having all these kind of broad swath but kind of bigger day jobs has kind of given you a really great feel for what AVAs to kind of try as you've gone on with Lawrelin? You've obviously, you moved, like you said, you moved out to Elephant Mountain, which is relatively, I think, pretty new to obviously to you guys. But
Hmm.
how have you looked at expanding out of Red Mountain since you started that way?
Um, yeah, certainly, definitely having day jobs where I get exposure to other fruit from all over the state has been uh, a great opportunity for me to decide what I wanted to do as far as the Lawrelin goes. I mean, you dialed right into that. That's exactly how Elephant Mountain became part of the program. When I started working with at Waloop Wine Company, there were a few different people that were sourcing Elephant Mountain Cab, Milbrant being one of them. Um, and it gave me a chance to see that fruit, see the vineyard, and make those wines. And after doing that for a couple of years, I I realized we need to get Elephant Mountain into the Lawrelin program. Um, I've known Dick Boucher for many years, actually, even right from my early days at Saint Michel, because he was bringing fruit into Saint Michel, and had a great rapport with him and a lot of respect for him, um, and had wanted to do work with him on a Lawrelin wine, and figuring out the timing, and just the opportunity. Um, so we were able to get that figured out with the 14 vintage. So really excited that those are in the pipeline. Um, Lonesome Spring Ranch, started working with them um, back in 2006, actually. I think Colin Morrell, it was a viticulturalist that I met at Saint Michel, and he left Saint Michel and started his own vineyard, and I had watched it develop over the years, and we'd stayed in touch. And so getting a chance to work with him has been great. Continue that relationship. And then one of the other more recent additions to the Lawrelin portfolio will be Lawrence Vineyard. We started working with Lawrence Vineyard in, let's see, I think that was 2016. And so over the course of many years, I've been able to work with fruit off of the Royal Slope, not only Lawrence Vineyard, but Frenchman Hills Vineyard, Stillwater Creek Vineyard. And I just really feel like there's something special about what's going on in that area. There's got to be some uniqueness to their microclimate. They've got Columbia River on the west side of the appellation, and the Potholes Reservoir on the east side of the appellation. And I think somehow those bodies of water are moderating that climate, moderating the heat, so they get a really long growing season, and the intensity of fruit character, along with the balance of the structure of the wines, the tannin structure of the wines, just really make some fantastic wines. And then the other thing that I liked about Lawrence Vineyard is the naming, being able to tie in with Lawrelin. Lawrelin is a combination of my parents' names, Lawrence and Eleanor. So having Lawrence Vineyard as one of the vineyard sources seemed to make sense from a branding perspective as well. So there was some a lot of compatibility to work with Josh.
Yeah, that's those are a lot of great vineyards. I agree. That kind of that slope there, Royal Slope. There's something unique. I passed up a contract in Frenchman one time, and I probably should go back and try and get it, because every wine that I've tasted out of there has been pretty good. So, so when you've approached making your wine to age versus some of the other wines that you're making, are you approaching these differently? Is there something that you're doing to these wines to try and create extended aging?
Ye- to a certain extent. I think it starts with vineyard sourcing, because I don't think I don't think all vineyards in Washington are set up to be age worthy, or as age worthy, should I say. So I haven't been all that eager to work with a lot of vineyards out of Walla Walla for Lawrelin, because although there's beautiful, magnificent vineyards over there, a lot of those vineyards, I think, they have higher pH soils, which translates to higher pH wines. It makes them very beautiful and elegant early and young, but I don't think that translates into age worthiness. So I like to work with vineyards that have a little bit, retain their acid structure a little bit during ripening. And at times we will play with the acid and bump the acid up a little bit to give it more age worthiness that we're looking for. So, a lot of wines that we'll make or that I've made for different programs over the years, if it's an early release program style of wine, we're targeting pHs in the 3.8, 3.9, 4, even 4, with lower TAs. And for Lawrelin, I'm trying to max out our pHs in the 3.7 range, 3.75. If it creeps up to 3.8, that's not that big a deal. But I really think if you get over 3.8 is where you start to see a wine's age worthiness being, or the length of age worthiness being. So we've been trying to stay in the 3.7 range for the most part.
Interesting. That's cool. Are you looking at like 2 punch downs a day, or is it something where you maybe throw in extra or even less? Is that something that you found has helped aging or indifferent?
Yeah, I mean, early on, I thought ageability was related to tannin structure, and I think it is to a certain extent. But over the years, I've more and more, my opinion has changed to the fact that it's more about the acid balance in the wine. You have to have good balanced tannins. If you just work at extraction and you over extract the wine, over extract those skins and seeds, it doesn't necessarily make for a wine that's going to be age worthy. There's going to be a lot of tannin there. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be age worthy. So my approach has been try to create the best balanced extraction in the fermenter, and work the skins. If we're not getting the extraction we're looking for, we might add an extra punch down a day, but more often than not, it's 2 punch downs a day. Sometimes Red Mountain can have really big tannins, and so we'll probably press those off a little bit earlier, and try to minimize that extraction, and especially minimize that seed extraction, because that's where a lot of those bitter, really mouth-drying tannins can come from the seeds. So quite often with Red Mountain Cab, we're pressing those off between typically 6 and 8 bricks, maybe 9, sometimes even 10 bricks some years. Um, and we've got more than, ample extraction to work with. So the other vineyards that we're working with, we don't typically have to press off quite as early. Usually we can go a little drier. And I'm getting a little frog in my throat here. Excuse me.
No, no worries.
Need to be drinking more wine, I think.
Yep, that's the answer. So, I guess on that note, maybe we can go to the wine. We have the 2005 Syrah. I honestly know very little about some of these back vintage. I don't know really what any of the characteristics were in 2005. So some of those things, and maybe tell me kind of what your experience has been with this wine over its life since you've kind of had it around you for 15 years.
Well, I would say, first off, 2005 was a pretty warm year, especially by standards in those days. I think more recently we've had some warmer vintages, but I think 2004 was the warmest vintage of the recent vintages in that time frame. So 05 wasn't quite as warm as 04, but it was a little bit on the warm side, I guess. And there was a beautiful Indian summer at the end, which really worked well. Days stayed warm well into September, so we had a nice long ripening period right during harvest, which I think really helped wines. And what amazes me is, tasting these 05s, how youthful they are still. They're just,
Yeah.
It continues to surprise me how youthful they present themselves. And, they're almost 15 years old. So they have evolved over time. I think they've gotten more finesse and a little more elegance. Definitely, some of the tannin has dropped out. There is some precipitates in these bottles when you open them, and they've just really elegance and balance are kind of the key phrases that come to mind when I taste these wines.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Pierce has an acquaintance that has been looking for kind of that elegance and finesse Syrah down from California. He's looking for Washington Syrah, has that, and really this is kind of one of the few that I've kind of found that really kind of has that old world feel to it, where it has a mouthfeel more like Northern Rhone than you find in a lot of our wines, where it's not maybe so round and so fruity as you kind of see to get the approachability that this wine has. That's pretty neat, I think, for people to be able to experience that, because most people are really rarely going to see an 05, especially if they're kind of my age demographic, because we certainly weren't buying nice wine in 2005. So
Right.
it's really fun to kind of be able to experience this project, and really, really cool that you and Pierce have kind of hooked up.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about this. Yeah, this is a great opportunity. So we're really excited. And the other thing I should mention as I think about it is, especially with Syrah, I don't think a lot of new oak works really well on very many Syrahs. So we've always tried to keep the new oak component in the Syrah blends between the 40 to 50% new oak, usually more towards 40. But when you make 4 barrels, it's hard to it's hard to get you know,
We feel your
2/3 of a new barrel into it. So they've tended to be more like 50% new, I guess. But the new oak I think can overwhelm a lot of the Syrah, the subtleties of Syrah, and a lot of new oak comes across pretty heavy-handed. Certainly, with the age of these wines, the oak gets very well incorporated into the wine, and it's not sitting on the surface like a lot of my daughter's making faces. Sitting on the surface of the wine, and totally incorporated, so it becomes seamless. And I think it actually ends up lifting the fruit a little bit more than masking the fruit, which is always my concern with a lot of new oak in winemaking. And
I think maybe I would love your opinion on this. I think Washington, and maybe California to a certain extent too. I mean, we kind of learned with some of the bigger red varietals in Cab and Merlot, and I think that those take to oak really nicely. And so maybe on some level our assumption was that Syrah in a similar site would do the same, and maybe it hasn't quite as much, and it's a learning curve that we've maybe started to pick up on. I don't, I mean, my experience with Syrah, our decision as a winery this year is no new oak on any of our Rhones. I think the one that we kind of experienced that you maybe had some experience with was the Upper Vineyard Boucher Syrah actually did stand up to the new oak when we tried it out. But outside of that, I think my experience has been the same, where it feels like it's covering up kind of maybe some of the really bright spots that Syrah has, and maybe if it's been aged 15 years, it's integrated itself really nicely, but it feels, I think I feel pretty similar to you.
Yeah, I don't know if any people out there have had the opportunity to taste the 03 Syrah. I felt like the oak was a little heavy-handed in 03. I used a heavier toast barrel, which probably wasn't the best decision. Although I've met a lot of people that love that smoky character that has come from that heavier toast barrel. So it is, the thing about wine, it's like art. It's all in the eye of the beholder. So, but I tried it on the 03, and I drifted, back to, or pulled back to more of a medium toast barrel for the Syrah since then, because I just felt it had pushed things a little too far stylistically from where I wanted to go with wines. So, but live and learn.
Yeah, I mean, that's the fun part about wine, right? I mean, you've experienced it more than most, where you get X number of vintages, you get one try a year, and you get to make it, whatever changes you want,
Yep.
the next year. It's a really kind of unique experience that, a lot of industries don't have, where you have a finite number of times you get to try new things.
Definitely, yeah. You can improve those odds a little bit if you go down to the southern hemisphere. But yeah, you're pretty limited in how many harvests you're gonna be able to do in a career. So.
Yeah, it's a bummer in one sense and pretty fun in another sense. So.
Yeah, well, and in all honesty, for me, that was a real appeal about winemaking, because as I mentioned, maybe I didn't mention it, but when I was, the summer before I went down to UC Davis, I had taken a brewing and winemaking class. I actually worked in a microbrewery in Edmonton the summer before I went to Davis, and at that age, you know, beer still is really important to me, but you know, I was considering a brewing career at the same time, and sitting on that fence. Um, and one thing that I've learned uh, is that brewing cycle, if you're brewing every week, um, each week is very similar to the next. And one thing that I love about winemaking is that the cycles are a little bit longer. And so, you know, one week isn't necessarily exactly the same as the next. It's that annual cycle. So you've definitely got, you know, a harvest season, a blending season, a bottling season, and dealing with the growing season amongst that as well. So uh, that those cycles being a little bit longer and a little bit more drawn out just are a better fit with me and my makeup, I guess. So that's definitely one of the things that drew me in and sealed the deal to pursue winemaking as opposed to pursue brewing.
Maybe you just explained why I like to make wine versus beer, and I didn't even know it. I just had a question. How many years does this wine, I think is most of the question, spend in barrel versus in bottle? So I guess how many years was it in barrel prior to being?
It was in barrel for about 2.5 years. Let's see, I've got some information in front of me.
Do you feel like you kind of found a sweet spot for, I mean, different varietals versus, I mean, maybe even vineyards? Have you kind of found that it's 2.5 years, or is it better for 3 or better 2?
Um, it, I think, I think for Syrah, we were pushing the limit. At, it was 34 months in barrel. Just looking at my notes here. Um, you know, I think that's probably at the long end of the spectrum. I've kind of settled into something where it's more like 24 to 28 months. I think is the sweet spot from a barrel aging perspective. It does depend on the vintage a little bit. I think if it's a warmer vintage, a riper vintage, I think the wines evolve a little bit accelerated pace. So you want to go more to that 24-month period. If it's a cooler vintage, I think the wines tend to evolve in barrel, take a little bit longer to evolve in barrel. So more like 28 in those cooler vintages.
Cool. That's a lot of experience to kind of figure that out. So it's kind of cool to hear that. That's one of those things where, you know, like 2 vintages in, we're kind of like, no, I don't know what the right answer is. So you're kind of guessing. But,
Yeah, I mean, you just have to go with your gut, you know, to some extent. I think keep tasting the wine, and you know, because really you won't know the answer for a while, and after the decision's already been made. So,
right.
But you know, I mean, at least for me, that's how I approached it, was just go with my gut, and you know, when in doubt, that's one of the things that I think was fantastic for me about being able to work with Charlie and Mike Janik, because even today I can still reach out to those guys and run things by them, and you know, I drop in and chat with Charlie pretty much on a weekly basis, and most of the time we're just, you know, shooting the bull, but sometimes you actually sit down and talk winemaking.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of experience between you guys. There probably aren't, you know, 3 people in the state that have more than you guys. It's a lot of vintages. So it's pretty neat to be able to do that.
Yeah, I treasure that relationship. He's a super guy, and definitely my mentor for sure. My biggest mentor. Absolutely.
I know there's at least one person on here who's a Fatalitas disciple, and that they gave me a real cool bottle for my engagement from one of his. I was pretty stoked to get. So
Nice.
yeah. Well, if anybody has any questions, I'll throw them at Kendall here. I could talk to him probably for several days, but I won't hold you guys on with us. But it's been a real pleasure to listen to you, and I look forward to drinking more of your wines, and hopefully getting these in front of a lot of people, because it's a really, like I said, a unique thing to be able to do that, and I hope people take advantage of that resource to kind of learn more about Washington wine and be able to taste a 05 next to a 2016 or 17. It's cool.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Been great getting to know you and Pierce, and yeah, we at home, we tend to drink older wines. That's our house palate. It hasn't necessarily been the best business model, but it's certainly, I think shows people how wonderful Washington wines can age, and the benefit of aging wines. Because I really think there is a benefit to it, that even though from a winemaking perspective, we've made a lot of strides in making wines more approachable at a younger age. But I haven't found anything where I think it would totally replace bottle aging. I think wines still take on this added nuance, this added finesse and elegance that happens over time in a bottle that we can't duplicate in the winery.
You're kind of letting it live its life, right? It's kind of a living, breathing entity in and of itself, and we can control it to a point, but kind of letting it do its thing is kind of the beauty of having a wine 15 years later. You really don't know what it's going to be unless you let it do it.
Yeah, definitely. We tasted the 01 cab not too long ago, and it was still tasting beautifully. So we've got a couple cases of our 2000 cab tucked away for our daughter. She was born in 2000, so as long as she doesn't take too long to find somebody, we're hoping we can serve it at her wedding one day.
No pressure.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, we'll see.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. I'll look forward to talking to you again really soon, but I'll let everybody go here. And thanks to everybody for joining us. I think this was the last one in kind of our group 2, and we're jumping into the third round next Saturday. That one will be 5 p.m. because we're talking to somebody on the East Coast. So look forward to talking to you all then. And again, great to talk to you.
All right. Yeah. Great talking to you guys. Cheers. Thank you. Thanks
Cheers.
for the opportunity.
Kendall, thank you so much for joining.